Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Philippe, and also thank you, Martin, for inviting me. I'm very excited to share these new results of this new modeling method. So today I'll be talking about hydromechanical earthquake cycles in a poro-visco-elasto-plastic fluid-bearing fault structure. So when we talk about fluids, we know that they are very important and they affect both tectonic processes, but also earthquake source processes. Here we have a very simple two examples of how fluid interacts on faults, either on a strike slip faults or on subduction megathrust. And we know that the percolation of fluids could be responsible for a variety of different processes, such as seismic swarms, triggering of earthquakes, or even probably the occurrence of slow slip events. Fluid in general are also becoming even more important because the injection of fluids on natural faults are creating a growing interest in understanding how the transient source of fluids could affect the response on faults. And this could be the case for geothermal energy or CO2 storage, or even injection of wastewaters associated with hydraulic fracking. When we look at the subduction zones, here we have a very simple example that shows that we have a sort of like a depth varying slip behavior from seismic to aseismic slip. So in the shallower portion of the megathrust in this region is where we have regular earthquakes. While moving down deep, we have a transition from seismic events to aseismic behavior. What controls this transition is still unclear, and we know that probably temperature-related processes and fluid-related processes are probably affecting the occurrence of seismic and aseismic slip. And we also know that these two regions are very close to each other, and sometimes they interact with each other. We have examples of slow slip events that they could trigger an earthquake, or the other way around, when we have an earthquake that is triggering a slow slip event. So we know that these two regions, there is like a sort of interplay between these two regions, but the mechanics and the reason why we have this depth varying behavior is still not very clear. What we usually assume is that by going down deep, we have a release of fluids, and because of that, the effective normal stress is low. In many cases, and I will show later some examples of some numerical simulations, we typically assume a very low effective normal stress, but we also assume this value to be constant. And in this case, we typically assume a value that could be of the order of 5 to 10 megapascal. And this reflects the scenario where we have the dehydration of fluids from the subducting slab, and these fluids are then trapped in the corner of the contact between the upper plate and the subducting plate, where we have supposedly a low permeability zone. And because of that, the effective normal stress is always low. But once again, the point is that the effective normal stress is supposed to be low, but we also don't know how this could vary over long-term periods or even during the earthquake cycle. One of the most fascinating example of a deep varying slip behavior is the Cascadia example, where we have the shallower portion of the megathrust that is locked and overall quite silent in terms of seismicity. Then we have a sort of like a gap where we have a stable seismic creep, and then a slow slip event region. Here you can see the cumulative slow slip over 10 years of slow slip events. So when we try to simplify this scenario, we know that we have this shallower portion of the megathrust, and then we have these narrow regions of slow slip events. We can design some very simple model driven by rate and state friction, where we can assume, for example, a velocity weakening patch that is very elongated along strike and with a pretty narrow width, like in this case, where you can see the example from Cascadia, where we have a width that is of the order of 20 to 25 kilometers, extending for hundreds of kilometers along strike. And this patch is embedded into a velocity strengthening region. So we know that in order to simulate slow slip events with rate and state friction, we need to assume a so-called nucleation size that is larger than the width. This is one way to simulate slow slip events. So when we look at the estimate of the nucleation size, we know that we have different parameters that are affecting that. But we also know that the effect in normal stress is probably one of the main parameters that could affect the nucleation size, especially if you assume that the rate and state parameters are kind of constant because they are maybe material dependent. An increase in the pore fluid pressure could cause a decrease in the effective normal stress. And this could explain why we have a nucleation size larger than the width. And in this scenario, we can simulate slow slip pulses propagating along strike along this velocity weakening patch. So when we take into account these rate and state models and we assume a low effective normal stress, we typically assume a low value, as I said before, and this could be of the between 5 to 10 megapascal. And here you can see an example of this type of simulations where we have the propagation of the slip rate on this patch. So here you can see the nucleation of a slow slip event. And here another one that is first nucleating as a circular event. And then as soon as they saturate at the width of the velocity weakening patch, they start to propagate along strike. So as long as the nucleation size is larger than the width, the instability is never growing into a dynamic instability that goes up to meter per second. And the slip rate is always confined between a value that is of the order of 10 to minus 7, 10 to minus 5 or so. And just by having very different variations in the pre-stress on the fault, we can have these variations in the size of slow slip events. So this model assumes constant values of effective normal stress, but also rate and state parameters. But the small variations in the pre-stress could cause a difference in the size and the long-term pattern of slow slip events. However, recent observations also point out that slow slip event could be triggered by fluid pressure cycling that are occurring on the fault due to processes such as dehydration. And in the case of subduction zone, we know that this could happen in the down deep region of the seismogenic zone, and this continuous fluid release, especially in a fault zone that is supposedly to be with low permeability, is causing this fluid pressure cycling. So the question is how we can understand how these processes are affecting the occurrence of both seismic and aseismic slip. So when we take into account this question, there are kind of like a competing effects with each other. So the answer is not very clear. We know, for example, that from elastic dislocation theory and constitutive laws, pore fluid pressure may inhibit dynamic instabilities that grows into a dynamic rupture. And high pore fluid pressure causes a reduction in the effective normal stress. So in theory, it should promote a stable slip rather than dynamic rupture. On the other hand, we also know that pore-pressurization could cause fault failure. But at the same time, we know that other processes such as dilatancy, so an increase in the effective normal stress during shearing, could counteract pore pressurization and promote stability. So, and at the same time, we know that when the pore fluid pressure is increasing, the nucleation size is also increasing. So when the nucleation size increases, we typically have a more stable fault, or at least we should promote failure, but inhibit the onset of seismic slip. So all these processes are affecting each other, and it's still not very clear how fluids affect seismic and aseismic slip. So in particular, when we take into account a coupled system where fluids and solid rocks are interacting with each other, we know that due to the poroelastic effect, we could have very different variations in the effective normal stress. So understanding what is the state of stress and the pore pressure in and also off the fault is very challenging, and also understanding how this pore fluid pressure is evolving during the earthquake cycle. And another possible question is whether these variations in the effective normal stress, which are caused by the pore fluid pressure, are also affecting the slip behavior on the same fault segment. So for this reason, we try to develop a new hydromechanical earthquake cycle code, which couples solid and fluid interaction. The code solves the fundamental equation for the total momentum. So here you can see the total momentum for solid matrix and fluid, where we have the inertia term of the density, total density, and the derivative of the velocity over time. This term is a simplification because we neglect the difference in the acceleration between the solid and the fluid. So this term could be decomposed into the solid part and the fluid part. But since the acceleration in the fluid part is considered negligible, we typically assume in this type of simulations that the inertial term is the one driven by the solid component. And this code also solves the fluid momentum, where we take into account the ratio between the permeability and the viscosity of the fluid. This is the so-called Darcy viscosity. And then we also take into account the pore-elastic constant, such as the drain bulk modulus, the Biot-Willis coefficient, the compaction viscosity, and also the Skepton coefficient for the fully compressible fluid mass. So with this type of numerical framework, we can have a fully dynamic code that also takes into account the compressibility of both the solid part, but also the fluid part. So the pore-elastic constants are quite important, and I will talk more about that later in the next slides. But it's important to point out that these constants, they strictly depend on the compressibility of both the solid part and the fluid phase. In most of the simulations, I'm using standard values for the compressibility of the solid part and also the fluid phase. But I will also try to test the different values, especially for the fluid component, because the response, the pore-elastic response of the fault zone could dramatically change when we assume a different value of the compressibility for the fluid phase. So this type of codes also assume a Maxwell Visco-Elasto-Plastic model, where we have the viscous component defined by the ratio between the stress and the shear viscosity. Then we have the elastic component, where we have the shear modulus and the time derivative of the shear stress, the co-rotational time derivative of the shear stress. And then we have the plasticity, which takes into account a rate strengthening rheology. So our model assumes that we compute the Druger-Prager plasticity, and on top of that, we also assume a rate strengthening component, where we have the ratio between the second invariant of the plastic strain rate and a reference strain rate over a certain exponent gamma. So to talk more about this plasticity model, in a way, this plasticity model assumes that we have a rate strengthening behavior that is pretty much close to the direct effect of rate and state, which means that an acceleration in the slip rate is initially causing a strengthening on the fault, a transient strengthening. and this strengthening is defined by the exponent gamma. So these plasticity models assume that we couple the Druger-Prager plasticity and the rate strengthening component. And of course, this value is dictating whether we have a seismogenic zone or a rate strengthening behavior similar to the rate state friction models. So in this type of simple simulations, we assume a plane strain strike slip model, where we assume a fault in the middle and we loaded the fault with a certain plate rate from the top and the bottom. We assume a certain fluid flux from the bottom and the top, as you can see here with these blue arrows. And we take into account rate strengthening that is high from the left and the right side of the model and lower in the middle where we have the seismogenic zone. So in this way, we can have seismic events that are nucleating and propagating from the center of the fault, but we don't rupture all the way to the boundaries. Here you can see some of the first examples of this type of simulations where we have regular cycles of slip events that are nucleating from the center of the fault, and then they propagate bilaterally on the left and the right side, all the way to the regions where we have this high rate strengthening of the fault. In this case, all the properties on the fault and the initial conditions are homogeneous, and because of that, the model yields regular cycles of complete ruptures. So it's interesting to see that without a rate and state friction, we can simulate cycles where we have the slip rate that is increasing from centimeter per second, centimeter per year during the interseismic periods, all the way to meter per second during the propagation of seismic rupture. And in the same way, the adapting time stepping is varying from years down to milliseconds during the propagation of dynamic rupture. The most interesting part is the effective pressure, which is the difference between the total pressure and the fluid pressure. So in this case, you can see that during the propagation of dynamic rupture, the effective pressure is decreasing by several megapascal. And this is because the fluid pressure of the crack tip is significantly increasing during the propagation of these events. And straight after the event, we have a recovery of the effective pressure, while part of that is recover over longer period due to a pore-pressure diffusion. Here you can see an evolution of a different event, of a series of events. And in this map, we have the slip rate on the fault. On the y-axis, I'm showing the time step because I cannot show the time, otherwise we cannot observe the events because they are occurring over like a few seconds compared to the long-term pattern of these events. And on the x-axis is the fault. So here you can see a sequence of 4 regular events on the fault where we can simulate the initial locking on the fault and then the loading and the creeping that is progressively migrating from the right and the left boundaries of the fault towards the center. And then we nucleate an event from the center and it propagates all the way to the fault. And here you can see instead the cumulative slip over several cycles. So the red lines display the cumulative slip during the coseismic phase. The blue lines, the aseismic slip that are between the plate rate and the coseismic slip rates. And then in gray, the interseismic slip. So in this particular case, because of the initial conditions, the nucleation size is rather big. And because of that, we nucleate events from the center of the fault. So here you can see an example of that where the nucleation size is of the order of 7 kilometers. So These are very generic simulations, at least to test the methodology. And from there on, we also try to simulate more complicated scenarios. When we look at what happened exactly in terms of slip rate, pore pressure evolution, and so on, and the feedback also with the viscosity, we know that when plastic yielding occurs, we have a compaction of the solid matrix, and this compaction is causing an increase in the pore pressure within the fault zone, and this compaction and self-pressurization of fluids is then causing a shear strength drop. And because of that, strain rate is localizing, and the slip rate accelerates on the fault. And this sort of like feedback is causing the propagation of dynamic rupture. Here you can see an example of the evolution on the fault of the fluid pressure, which is increasing during the propagation of events, and then it goes back to the background value. And in this way, we can reproduce cycles of many events. And at the same time, here you can see a plot of the viscosity on the fault, where the viscosity is dropping by more than 10 orders of magnitudes during the dynamic propagation of events. From here, the center of the fault, where the viscosity is relatively high, down to a value of the order of 10 to 8, 10 to 9. When we try to instead vary the pore pressure on the fault, we can start to see small variations in the pattern of the fault. For example, when we try to decrease the fluid pressure, the effective pressure is higher. And because of that, the nucleation size gets smaller. And in this case, we can start to propagate fluid-driven shear cracks from one side of the model, because the nucleation size is sufficiently small. In this case, you can see a pattern of a series of events where we have events nucleating from one side of the fault and propagating on the other side. And this is the case for a model 2 that you can see here with this black line. When we instead try to increase the pore fluid pressure, the effective pressure on the fault is always relatively low. And because of that, we tend to have a pattern of slow slip events. In some cases, we also have faster events that are occurring because of the variations in the effective pressure on the fault, which is also dynamically changing due to the history of slip on the fault. And because of that, we can start to have this more complicated pattern of different events that are smaller, and they are evolving in time. So the reason why we can propagate dynamic ruptures without having a friction law, such as, for example, latent state, is because during the yielding phase, as I said before, we have a compaction on the fault. And this compaction is immediately counteracted by the fluid increase due to decompaction of the fluid. These two mechanisms are very efficient because they cause a strong decrease in the yield strength on the fault. So here you can see the evolution of the solid compaction, which is controlled by the visco-plastic components, and the fluid decompaction, which is controlled by the elastic component of the fluid filled pores. So in this case, you can see that we have the nucleation phase and then the propagation on one side. When we try to plot the solid compaction and the fluid decompaction, you can see that we have this propagation of this sort of like narrow pulse-like solitary pore pressure wave. And this mechanism is controlling the propagation of these events in the form of a pore pressure wave. So here you can see that during the propagation, if you take different profiles over time, we have these two mechanisms that they are counteracting with each other. and the magnitude of them is similar, but it's not the same, because at the end of each event, we typically have a slightly larger compaction component over the compaction phase. So due to this mechanism, we can have seismic events even without any friction law. So before I was discussing the role of the compressibility for both the solid component and the fluid phase. The fluid phase, at least we know that it's of the order of 4×10⁻⁻10 in the case of water. But we also know that when the fluid phase is mixed with CO2, for example, the compressibility of the fluid phase could change by up to 2 orders of magnitude. And so because of that, the poroelastic response on the fault zone could change significantly. So in this type of simple simulations, we also try to run a bunch of experiments where we try to vary both the solid compressibility and the fluid compressibility, and also by assuming a different porosity for the fault, from 1% to 10%, which I would say they represent some kind of n members of porosity, because we know that the porosity could change particularly between these two values. It's interesting to see that when we try to run these experiments, we got a behavior that is strictly dependent on the fluid compressibility, meaning that by changing the fluid compressibility, we can have a change in the slip response that is from seismic events up to slow slip events, and then a transition to simply stable creep. When we try to increase the porosity, this transition gets broader, but the general pattern is very similar. So these results, even though they are rather simple in the way we assume them, the model and the initial conditions, are telling us that the fluid compressibility is strongly affecting the fault response from seismic events to slow slip events and aseismic creep. Another important feature that I would like to point out with this type of simulations is that when we look at the evolution of the model, the rate strengthening behavior is particularly controlling the nucleation phase. So in this first panel, you can see that if you take into account the logarithmic time to rupture, we have this initial and slow nucleation phase, which is very similar to the nucleation phase that we can observe in rate and state friction models. And as soon as we reach the critical nucleation size, then we have this runaway process. When we try to also look into the fracture energy of these fluid-driven shear cracks, we know that because of the constitutive model we have, our d sub c is not constant, but it depends on the initial conditions on the fault, but also on the evolving condition of, for example, the pore fluid pressure on the fault, which is changing from one event to another. So here is just an example of our fracture energy, where you can see that our d sub c, which is the critical slip weakening distance, is relatively large compared to typical rate and state friction models, in this case of the order of 2 meters. And because of that, our fracture energy tend to be quite large compared to those type of simulations, especially if they don't include any enhanced dynamic weakening mechanism. So when we look at the evolution of the shear strength during these phases of strain localization and the nucleation phase, here you can see the drop in the shear strength when the cumulative slip is increasing. And you can see in this phase of the shear strength drop that we reach the peak in the shear velocity when we reach the dynamic value of shear strength. and this corresponds to the maximum, to the peak of the slip velocity. So we try to also compare this type of results with a compilation of different fracture energy with respect to sleep. Here you can see a compilation of different type of events, from very small events up to large subduction zone events. And previous studies have already pointed out that we can have a transition of the scaling from a fracture energy that is scaling with the square of the sleep for relatively small events to scaling relationship where the fracture energy is scaling as the 2/3 of the sleep for a very large earthquake. So in this zone. And this transition has been, for example, attributed to thermal pressurization or other enhanced dynamic weakening processes. In our type of simulations, the strength drop that we have due to the fluid pressure evolution is causing an important increase in the fracture energy. And this is also the way to explain possibly why we can have this type of scaling. At least in that type of simulations, we had a range of events that could cover only this part of the plot, because we just simulate a relatively large event, particularly because we assume a nucleation size that is relatively large compared to the length of the fault. But at least we can see that we can match this type of fracture energy even without including any enhanced dynamic weakening mechanism, because the fluid phase, the fluid weakening is already strong enough to cause an increase in the fracture energy for large earthquakes. In the second half of this presentation, I would also like to talk about some of these more advanced models where we try to simulate fluid pressure cycling in subduction zones, still by assuming a relatively simple model setup. So as we previously saw, we know that in subduction zone, we have dehydration processes that are occurring in the down deep region of the seismogenic zone. And probably in this region, because of the low permeability zone, we tend to have an effective pressure that is always very, very low. So we try to design very simple subduction model where we have a wedge and downgoing plate where we assume a certain velocity, a long-term loading rate. And we also try to test different hydraulic properties on the fault. For example, one of the critical parameters is, of course, the permeability within the fault. So we try to assume a permeability that is relatively high in the seismogenic zone, and then either constant all the way to the down deep region, or that is decreasing in the deeper region of the fault. And also we try, for example, to change the fluid flux, either by assuming a low but a rather constant value throughout the fault, or by increasing the fluid flux only in the down deep region of the fault. The reason why we have a low permeability zone is because we have different processes and different hypotheses have been proposed to explain this low permeability zone, either due to, for example, a volumetric expansion due to serpentinization, which is also decreasing the permeability, or we have a large deposit of silica during the release of these fluids, or, for example, we have a stacking of different shear zones. So due to this sort of like underplating processes in the down deep region of the megatrust, we can have like some relict shear zones, and because of that, the permeability of the lower shear zone, of the lower and new shear zone, is always lower compared to this relict shear zone on top of that. So when we try to assume homogeneous hydraulic properties on the fault, we typically have regular cycles similar to what you saw before. So we have these regular events that are nucleating from the down deep region of the megathrust, and they propagate all the way to the trench. So this model is very similar to the simple strike slip model that I showed you before. It's just showing that we can have the nucleation only from one side of the fault, where most of the creep is occurring, especially in this down deep region of the fault. The most interesting result is that when we start to assume a depth varying permeability structure, the long-term pattern of events is changing significantly. We start to have small events and larger events. So overall, the low permeability is reducing the fluid mobility, of course, but is especially doing that in the regions where we nucleate most of these events. And because of that, the interseismic periods of events in general is getting shorter over time. This premature nucleation of seismic events is then leading to the emergence of a partial and complete rupture. So here you can see the slip rate on the fault over several earthquake cycles, and you can see that we have like a sequence of events. In some cases, we have a partial rupture, and then is followed by an aftershock a few hours after this first and more deep event. So because of this simple depth varying permeability structure, we can have this like more complex and realistic pattern of events on the megathrust. So when we look at the pore fluid pressure on the fault, you can see here that during the propagation of events, the fluid pressure is always high. But when we look at also the evolution of the long-term fluid pressure in the down deep region, you can see that from this region on, this pore fluid pressure tends to be slightly higher than the seismogenic zone. And because of that, the interseismic periods of slip events is getting shorter over time. When we look at, for example, the cumulative slip in this case, it's interesting to see that we have this partial rupture followed by sometimes these aftershocks. Another interesting feature is that partial rupture are always producing 4 to 5 meters of slip in the down deep region, while the large events or the aftershocks are causing larger slip because we typically have a larger slip deficit over time. So when we activate the shallower portion, the slip deficit is typically larger than in the down deep region because they didn't produce enough seismic events. So even during the propagation of large events, all the way from the bottom to the trench, the cumulative slip is not constant, but we typically have from 4 to 5 meters in the down deep region up to 7, 8 meters in the shallower portion. And another interesting feature is that due to the increase in the pore fluid pressure on the fault, these large events are typically followed by a seismic transient, which is then decreasing over time due to pore pressure diffusion. So these blue lines are showing that we can actually have a substantial slip after an event. So they're even producing some post-seismic slip within the seismogenic zone. This is, of course, a transient effect because as soon as the pore fluid pressure decreases, then this effect tend to vanish over time. And finally, another interesting model that I would like to show is that when we try to combine both depth varying permeability on the fault, but also a depth varying fluid flux, we have a very interesting behavior on the fault because we tend to have like two distinct domains within the fault. We have a shallower regions where we have seismic events, so like a shallower seismogenic zone, and then a deeper slow slip event region where the fluid pressure is always high, and we can have this sort of like a separation of these two domains, where we have slow slip events only in the down deep region, and then seismic events in the shallower portion. depending on the hydraulic properties on the fault, this transition could either be very sharp or smooth, where these two regions can kind of interact with each other. And so this model is kind of demonstrating that by simply changing the hydraulic properties on the fault, we could either have a slow slip event domain that is interacting with the seismogenic zone, or is rather separated by the seismogenic zone. So because of the combination of the pore fluid pressure and also the low permeability, the fluid pressure on the fault, and also the combination of the fluid flux, the fluid pressure on the fault is relatively higher in the slow slip event region. Here you can see the long-term evolution in the slow slip event region compared to the seismogenic zone here in red. And you can see that the fluid pressure is always high, and the pressure drop is relatively smaller compared to the seismogenic zone. So because of that, we can either have seismic events or slow slip events based on the mechanism that that we have in this type of simulations. What is controlling the propagation of slow slip events, or rather a seismic event, is the fluid pressure drop. So by increasing the pore fluid pressure, our pore pressure drop is kind of limited, and because of that, we tend to have slow slip events in the down deep region, while in the shallower portion, the pore fluid pressure, at least the background value, is relatively low, and the pore pressure drop during seismic events is much larger. And because of that, we can have the propagation of dynamic ruptures. So with this type of model, where we combine the depth varying permeability, but also the depth varying fluid flux, we can have this sort of like behavior that is in a way proposing or demonstrating that we can either have a seismic and aseismic slip on the same fault segment, but at the same time, the hydraulic properties are kind of separating the regions where we could have either slow slip events and seismic events in the shallower portion, similar to what we observe in Cascadia, for example. The final results that I would like to show you for this presentation is the combination of the fault permeability and the fault porosity. So we try to run also a series of simulations where we try to understand how these two parameters are affecting the nucleation of seismic or slow slip events. So here we have a comparison between the fault porosity and fault permeability. I would like to point out that the fault permeability is not a constant value, but it depends on the porosity itself, based on this equation where n is the exponent that is typically 3. So by changing the porosity and the permeability on the fault, we try to just analyze whether we can have fast events or aseismic slip events when they are below or above a certain velocity threshold, which is of the order of a few centimeters per seconds. So it's interesting to see that the behavior is showing a pattern of a different slip response, similar to what has been already observed in rate and state friction models. There is an interesting study from Liu and Rice in 2007, where they proposed this sort of like a slip spectrum from seismic to aseismic slip. It is interesting to see that we can kind of reproduce the same type of pattern just by changing the hydraulic properties on the fault. So when we are within this range where we have these purple points, here we have an example from the panel B, we can rather have fast slip events. But as soon as we try to move towards low permeability, we have a transition first with slow slip events. And then when we decrease the permeability even further, we have the so-called decay oscillations, where the next event is always slower than the previous one, up to a point where we have a stable creep. This type of result is quite interesting because it's telling us that the permeability that we have on the fault is too low. And because of that, every time we have an event, the pore pressure is increasing. So after each event, the pore pressure is increasing and the effective pressure is instead decreasing, up to a point where the pore fluid pressure is closer to the effective one. And because of that, we cannot have any event. And this is showing by this sequence of smaller and smaller events. And at the same time, when we move towards a very high permeability, the system, at least the fault zone, can be considered as drain, which means that any increase in the compaction due to strain localization is not causing any self-pressurization of the fluid because the permeability is simply too high. So fluids can, at least in the time scale of the nucleation phase, they can escape outside the fault. And because of that, we can have just a failed event, as you can see here with this very small peak. And after that, we typically have just simple stable sliding. When we look at the transition between this seismic to a seismic slip, you can see that for a low permeability, we have this slope, which actually is matching the cubic scaling between the porosity, porosity dependent permeability and the porosity based on this equation. Instead, when we try to increase the porosity for high value of permeability, the transition is kind of different, because in the first part, this is actually related to seismic events that they can occur even for very high permeability of the order of 10 to 11, 10 to 10, which is quite high, I would say. And in this case, we can still have seismic events simply because the increase in the porosity is increasing the storage capacity. So the poroelastic response on the fault is much different, and we can have a larger compaction of the fault zone. So even though the permeability is higher, we can still nucleate seismic events. But then at some point here you can see that the line is vertical because we reach some sort of like saturation value, where the hydraulic diffusivity here is faster than the fluid pressurization during the nucleation phase. So when we reach that condition, we will not have any seismic event. So we reach some sort of like a permeability threshold, after which we cannot have any seismic event. So here I have some of the conclusions for this presentation. So is quite interesting to see that we can trigger some instabilities that are rather different compared to rate and state friction models, simply because they are controlled by the compaction and decompaction of the fault zone, which is causing a self-pressurization of fluid inside the undrained fault zone. When I say undrained, is because at least in the time scale of the nucleation phase, the permeability is sufficiently low to define the fault zone under undrained condition. And this is causing the propagation of solitary pore pressure waves. The hydraulic properties are also controlling the slip response from the long-term pattern, as you saw before, with small and large events or even aftershocks, or even the propagation of slow slip events for relatively high pore fluid pressure. We know that multiple weakening mechanisms can operate on active faults, especially when we reach meter per second of slip rate. But our results are suggesting that this self-pressurization of fluid-filled porous rocks may be the dominant contributor to fault fracture energy, particularly for large earthquakes like in subduction zones. And in general, these type of results are also pointing out that we need to include a realistic hydromechanical structure of faults in order to investigate seismic and aseismic slip, either for natural faults, but also in case of anthropogenic scenarios. So with this slide, I finish, and I'll be happy to take questions.